And so to be able to survive against all those odds seemed nearly impossible. But Shackleton had been on many expeditions. He was this brilliant man who was not just brilliant at adventuring, but he had a deep understanding of people and himself. So the first thing he realized is, in order to get out of this horrible situation, he would have to be making a series of decisions. The most important would be when to abandon the ice floe and try and go somewhere else. And if he listened to his emotions, if he panicked or he got doubtful, he wouldn't time this right. He would leave too early or too late. He had to calm himself down. He had to make sure that his decisions weren't being influenced by the men he was leading and what they were feeling. He had to step back and assess rationally what was the best time to leave, what was the best decision for that moment. The second thing was he had to deal with a very diverse group of men that came from all different backgrounds, social, economic backgrounds. And he was an incredibly empathetic person. He made a point of getting inside the spirit of each one of his men. He talked their language. To the photographer on the ship, he talked like a photographer. He got inside his more artistic point of view. To the carpenter who was from a lower class, he suddenly talked more of his language. He got into the spirit of each of these men so that he could figure out their moods and anticipate when they might start getting kind of negative and infect the group with doubts. And he was very sensitive to each person. He understood that the group had a dark side, that this could ruin any chances of success, that the great enemy wasn't the weather or anything, but it was from within, the human spirit. So he organized all of these things that could channel this dark energy. He organized big soccer games on the ice so they could get out their competitive spirit. He organized all these kind of festivals where they could get drunk and rowdy and raunchy, and he didn't stop it. Basically, he tried constantly to elevate the group spirit so that they would not start doubting themselves. On and on and on. And through this process, he figured out the moment when they left the ice floe. They got on their little life preservers, their lifeboats, and they traveled some 300 miles to an island, the Elephant Island, where they now were on solid ground, but on a tiny beach where they wouldn't survive. And then he took one of these little boats, with them was 6 men who he had carefully chosen. He crossed the most treacherous waters on the planet, 800 miles, with waves 30, 40 feet high, to South Georgia Island, where he was able to get a rescue ship, and all 27 men survived. It is considered one of the most remarkable survival and rescue stories in the history of mankind, and Sir Henry Shackleton has gone down in history. Any books on leadership are always quoting the story of Shackleton and what he accomplished on that journey. Now, and basically he did this through his knowledge of himself, through his incredible empathetic connection to his men, and through his deep grasp of human nature. Now, I don't think here at Google you're ever going to be facing a circumstances as dire as what Shackleton faced. I'm not sure, but I don't think so. But as a social animal, we're always facing environments that are full of dangers, disappointments, toxic people, etc. And it is my belief and my hope that with a genuine understanding of human nature, which I've hoped to have sparked in you today, you can navigate even the most treacherous, dysfunctional environment you'll ever encounter and handle those toxic people that will inevitably cross your path. And that you'll be able to develop that empathy that I think is the most powerful tool that any human could possibly possess. Thank you so much for this. I'm sorry about how long it went. I thought it was a much shorter talk than it was. But anyway, thank you.
So how do you have a more empathetic relationship with your shadow? And do you have any examples of how an individual used their shadow to be more productive in what they wanted to accomplish?
Yeah, you do have to be more empathetic. It's like a child inside of yourself that you have to finally accept and come to terms with and kind of love in a way. So I noticed my own shadow, for instance. I like to think of myself as this rigorously independent person. But basically what it's disguising, because the shadow also, I didn't completely go into everything. The shadow is not just your dark emotions, it's also your insecurities and your vulnerabilities that you're hiding from the world. And I'm hiding from the world, from the public, a kind of scared child. I want to be independent and assert that because I had parents that basically never gave me enough attention, so et cetera. I hope my mom's not watching this. Actually, I might want to rewind that. But anyway, so I tend to kind of go too far with this sort of behavior. I talk in the book about Abraham Lincoln, who had a very pronounced shadow. And this shadow had two sides to it. First, he was kind of morbid and a very sensitive person, almost kind of poetic in a way. He was obsessed with death. And he knew that if he let out this kind of obsessive, morbid, overly sensitive personality, it would get him in trouble. People wouldn't like it. He also was a very aggressive and belligerent people. These two sides lived in, these two aspects were both there at the same time. He was a belligerent person. You don't realize this, but he loved boxing, and he loved beating the hell out of people. And he was a boxer as a young man. And at one point in his life, he insulted another politician with very rude language. And he told himself, I'm never going to do this again. He saw his shadow operating. And so he learned to channel these two sides of himself in a way that would be productive. He turned that kind of morbid sensitivity into empathy, to the feeling that he didn't want to lose lives during the Civil War, that he wanted to end the lives of even Confederate soldiers was valuable to him. And he channeled that aggressive energy into winning the war, into strategizing, into being the most brilliant, rational strategist that ever lived. I tell people who are artists, use your anger, use your frustration and your anger and your hurts and put them into your work. Because, and films and books that do that grab an audience because we all have these emotions and these sides that we're tamping down. And that if you express your anger, it'll attract people like a magnet. So I want you to take it and channel that energy into something positive and productive. Don't be afraid you're very ambitious. Don't be afraid that you're aggressive, but put it into something that's actually productive and you'll accomplish something as opposed to hurting people. I mean, I have more in the book about that, but that's sort of, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Hey, Robert. Yeah. Hey, so you talked a lot about the power of empathy. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, let's say as a leader and having to make decisions sort of for the overall, like the best possible decision for the overall good, right? Even when sometimes it has to be kind of hard on certain groups of people, right? And then maybe like work harder to sort of get ahead in a certain environment. Like, what are your thoughts on maybe do you ever feel like too much empathy could lead to a little bit more of an irrational and emotional decision making?
Definitely, it's a very good question. Yeah, there's a level there where, as a leader in particular, you have to cut that off. But the empathy that you're having is, as a leader, you're there for the greater good. The group is coming together to create something positive. What I call a reality group. A reality group is a group that is together to make something, to create a product, to create a book or a film. It's not there for emotional purposes. It's not there for people to be friends or to get out their yayas. It's to make something. So you're grounded in reality, you're practical. And if you have 10 members and one of them is some kind of raging narcissistic asshole or whatever, you can't be empathetic to that person. You have to find a way to isolate them. So your empathy is geared towards the greater good of the group. I have a chapter on this. I have a chapter on authority. And I talk about the icon of that is Queen Elizabeth I that I discuss, who was an immensely empathetic person, but was in a terrible position as the female ruler at a time that women weren't supposed to rule. And so she created a style of authority that I think is incredibly powerful. And from her story, I kind of deduce certain laws. And so, for instance, if you need the group to work harder and they're slacking off, etc., You need to lead from the front. You need to set the example. If you set the example, if you set the tone and the spirit, people will follow you. And that's the mistake. So many mistakes that people make, leader-wise, is they think that it comes from other people, that their employees are to blame. They're lazy. They don't know what they're doing. It comes from you. You're not setting the tone. You have the power to set the right tone. You're in the office working till 9, 10 o'clock, and everybody sees that. They're going to follow your lead. They're going to see that you take responsibility for mistakes. You don't blame scapegoats. They're going to say, oh, I better take responsibility for myself. You're not favoring this person over that person. You're treating everybody more or less equally. Oh, okay, I'm motivated to work harder and earn his or her trust. Through the tone that you set, that's the power that you have as a leader. It's much better than yelling at people and berating them. So I agree, empathy can go too far in that case, and you have to set limits and boundaries. But more than anything, you have to set the proper tone for the group.
So I have a question about leadership. You mentioned that actually about culture, people in certain environment become very similar to each other, and we have a tendency to be like other people around us.
Culture.
I was wondering, yes, if you don't like something about the culture and you are not in the leadership position to set an example, how do you go about changing the culture?
It's extremely difficult, particularly if you're in a large company, because the culture is stronger than any individual, right? So if you're in a dysfunctional environment, and believe me, I've consulted with companies that I would call dysfunctional, you as an individual have very limited choices. And I've talked to people like that, and I say, in this situations, you have to be a little bit selfish. You have to see the skills that you can get. You have to learn from this. You have to learn the negative examples, and you have to get out as quickly as you can, because these kind of environments will drag you down. I say people can go crazy, can literally develop a mental illness by working in a dysfunctional group. It can infect you that you'll never get over the rest of your life, as opposed to working for a reality group or a positive place can actually improve your mental health. So first of all, don't be hubristic, don't be grandiose and think that you, one person, mid-level employee, is going to suddenly be, a shining knight in armor and going to change this culture. You can't. It's stronger than you are. And I talk in the book about the United States Pentagon, this very powerful, rooted military culture. And all these people came in thinking that they were going to be the ones that were going to alter the culture. John F. Kennedy was one. Lyndon Johnson was one. They didn't want to get deeper involved in the Vietnam War. They were going to change the culture. And the culture ended up changing them and ended up making them go further and further into the war. The culture will change you the longer you're in it. You won't change it. So have some humility, think about yourself, and as soon as you can, get out of it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, I want to see this throw. All right.
Hey, thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. So my question was, I'm a little curious about what you were discussing about the power of empathic ability and how I see it, like empathic ability.
Yeah.
How I see it that someone with a greater empathic ability would, in an interaction, have essentially a greater level of power, maybe to the point of like a manipulative capacity. And how is it possible to recognize this type of power dynamic, and like what's the best way to address that?
Very good question. So it's a known thing in psychology that a lot of psychopaths or sociopaths, whichever term you prefer, can be very attuned to other people. They have actually empathy, and that's what makes them such great manipulators. They're able to get inside the moods and ideas of people, and they know who you are, and that gives them the room to manipulate you. So it's a very good point. And I discuss this in the book, that there are different kinds of empathy. There's what I call analytic empathy, in which you are looking at the other person in a very analytic way. What's their weakness? What's their strength? Who are they? And I talk about visceral empathy. Visceral empathy comes from here, from the gut. It's a feeling. And I talk about we have this power. I can't read your thoughts, but through great knowledge of nonverbal behavior, which is part of my talk I didn't get to, I can feel what your mood is, what your emotions are, what your spirit is. And that creates a kind of visceral connection, a communication that predates words that we humans possess. And that kind of visceral empathy is more human, it's more elemental, it's more on the level of two fellow people communicating to each other. And the psychopath doesn't have that visceral empathy, which is what enables them to be so evil and nasty and manipulative. Because they can go inside your world and figure out how to mess with you, and they won't feel any compunction because they lack that quality that links two people from here, not from the heart, but from the viscera. And so, to have true empathy, you have to develop this other skill. And I say in there, having just visceral empathy is not enough either, because sometimes that gut feeling, that communication can be inaccurate. You can misread people. So you want to have that analytic ability. You want to have the ability to go, well, what was your childhood like? What was your mother like? Who are you? And analyze it. But you want it with this as well, because one without the other will make you a kind of inhuman beast. So that's the difference between the two.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Robert, for giving
Thank
this
you.
awesome talk.